So for those who have watched the previous video, we know that we created our own particle library, and using that, we created the Spark version of purple as well as the mastery versions of both red and blue. And in that very same video, you would also know that I said that the idea is to unlock the Spark version before the default purple, so making it weaker gives them an incentive to aim for the original one. Now, that's fine and all, like game design and all, perfectly okay, but the only issue here is that the current holo purple feels like a downgrade. So, yeah, let's remake purple. Like, imagine using Spark to kill enemies and then you finally unlock that so-called quote-unquote holo purple, only for it to look like this. Like fucking hell, bro. I would rather just stick with the Spark version at that point. Like, I could care less about the damage because it just looks cooler. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm proud of what I made, but after creating our own particle library, let's just say that the current holo purple is kind of outdated. You know, this actually reminds me of the time when I first made holo purple about 4 to 5 years ago. I don't remember exactly. Hold on, let me see. Let me see if I can find it. Let's see. Let us see. There it is. Like, the title is even cursed. Yeah, I think this was like my school project, if I remember correctly. I think this was when we had to use parametric equations to create something like applicable. I don't know. I remember being really proud of making this though, showing this to a bunch of my friends. But I mean, I mean, like, I guess that's cool. I mean, looking back at it now, I'd say it's all right. It's not bad, right? Don't get me wrong. It's not bad necessarily. In fact, this was the first time I started experimenting with using time variables. Because I remember in high school, when we were learning calculus, we'd spend so much time solving for the x, y, and t variables. But that was it. We never really got to like actually see how they could be applied in a meaningful way. I guess you could argue that word problems exist, but let's be honest, I never solved those word problems thinking that, oh yeah, I can relate to this, you know? Like I simply just memorized the keywords and in those word problems just to figure out how can I like create these equations and just solve for them. Like, that's it. So yeah, when I started working on this project, it was actually the first time I began to understand how these seemingly random math equations we were thrown in class could actually be used in a practical situation. Like, this was the moment where math went from just numbers on a page to something I could actually like actively use to create something cool. But yeah, like looking at this now, I think it'll be really fun to see how the new holo purple we're planning to make compares to this old version that we're seeing right now. We can see where I started versus where we are now. Oh yeah, and speaking of improvements, one of my Patreon members recently found a pretty wild exploit. Basically, if you spawn a max blue and then fire a max red into it, you can pretty much one-shot anything. This was not intentional, right? Yes, I've seen all the comments about the purple nuke, but that's for another time. Anyways, this exploit happens because max red is a projectile that constantly explodes, and max blue pulls objects into its center, so anything stuck inside blue ends up taking constant explosion damage. So I plan on also redesigning max red in the process. Alright, before we dive into remaking holo purple, we need to first get a general idea of what we're actually working with. Let's start with max red. I remember seeing a comment suggesting that max red should be turned into a laser-like beam. At first, I really liked the idea, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. A laser beam would essentially just be a faster version of the projectile, and it wouldn't really add any variety to the ability. So, to switch things up and make max red more interesting, I decided to turn it into a homing projectile, and when it hits its target, it creates a massive explosion. Now, as for holo purple though, the plan is to give it a complete visual redesign along with a small mechanic tweak. In the previous version, the rotation of the projectile was predetermined the moment you use the ability, but now we're adding a new layer of control. Players will be able to change its rotation before the red and blue mix. And once that mix happens, you won't be able to adjust it any further, and you'll also be stunned until it fires off. So now that we have a solid plan for both holo purple and max red, let's talk about how we're going to bring the player into the experience, first starting with first-person animations. So I'm sure you've seen these in my previous videos, the animated first-person hands. At first, I tried to look for a library or tool that I could use to animate them easily, but obviously, unfortunately, there weren't any. So after diving into Minecraft's code, I ended up creating a very scuffed tool, I'd say, that lets me manually adjust the transformations of the player's arms. With this, I can animate them over time by interpolating between different transformations. Let's take the purple build-up hand animation for example. First, I use my tool to position and rotate the arms exactly how I want. Then, I animate the arms by interpolating one transformation to another. However, the arms look a little stiff. In real life, whenever you use your hands, there's always some subtle movement or randomness behind it, because without it, the animation feels too mechanical. And so, to fix that, I added a touch of noise around the arms to introduce some natural variation. This makes arms feel much more alive and believable. Alright, so the homing logic. So the homing mechanic is specifically for the maximum red, and this is what we have. Okay, so the max red homing logic should be implemented into the game now. And so we can test it out by spawning a minecart and a pig in it. Okay, and if we shoot red, it should actually update its vector motion in real time. So instead of going straight, it will actually curve based on where the entity is. Yeah. So the homing mechanic works by fetching the target's position and using dot product to calculate whether the target is in front of the projectile, and if it is, it will try to redirect its vector motion towards that target. Now, this approach makes the homing feel smooth and dynamic, giving the projectile a realistic and intentional behavior. And as the homing projectile hits a block or entity, well, we now need to work on the explosion effect. Since we have our own particle library now, we can probably make this with ease. First, we created an impact effect by spawning X number of particles at a given point. Each particle is given custom motion data, allowing them to move outward and form an expanding circle. The custom motion data is determined by using a unit circle. We evenly distribute the X number of particles along the circle, with each particle storing specific angles that dictate how they should move. Now, if we set the radius to 0 at the start, all the particles originate from the central position. From there, they move outwards in a circular motion, creating this effect. And we end up with something like this. And to add on to that, we can also emphasize the explosion effect by adding impact frames. Alright, so impact frames. This topic is a little tricky compared to some of the other things we've talked about, mainly because of how impact frames are originally meant to work. Impact frames are, well, if we search up the definition, a series of drawings used to create a sense of power and direction in an animation. The key part here is that impact frames are predetermined. In animation, whether it be 2D or 3D, every single frame is technically drawn by hand, and impact frames are crafted with full knowledge of their surroundings. The artist can exaggerate specific movements, add stylized effects, or emphasize power by intentionally distorting or freezing certain frames. But in video games, it's kind of different. We don't have the luxury to draw every frame by hand because the environment and the interactions are dynamic. This means that the impact frame needs to work in real time and adapt to what's happening in the game. Now, for my mod, I wanted to create impact frames that feel dynamic. I used a combination of real-time shaders and effects to create an illusion of impact. Here's how it works. First, I apply a shader effect to the screen. The post-processing shader will desaturate the color and adjust brightness based on the current effect time, which adds a dramatic visual pause to the moment of impact. The shader also adjusts based on the time of day. For example, during nighttime, the brightness is reduced further to match the environment. Then we apply a subtle camera shake to amplify the power of impact. By combining these, we can create impact frames that adapt to the game in real time while still delivering the satisfying impact that players expect. And so with all the pieces in place, mechanics, visuals, and effects, it's time to put everything together. Let's create a remastered version of Hollow Purple and Maximum Output Red. And there you have it, the 2021, the 2023, and now the 2024 Hollow Purple. It's honestly so satisfying to see these visuals improve as I grow as a developer, because starting with command blocks back in 2012, it's just been really cool to witness Minecraft's evolution and how the community has always found ways to create incredible things, even with early limitations. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you would like to support me, I do have a Patreon in the link in the description below. But other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.